Hi, good day everyone. I am Isabella Margarita and together with one of my closest friends, Kim and Racy, we will be tackling today about privatization and insolvency in general. Now, let's get started. So as I film this video, you probably have heard what privatization is. But before we proceed with the methods of privatization, let us add a few things to our knowledge this afternoon as I show you the examples of privatized enterprises in the Philippines. These are Petron, MWSS, Philippine Airlines, Philpost, and PLDT. Unfortunately, due to the limited local resources, I haven't been able to classify the type or method of privatization that has been used with the said enterprises. However, the objective of privatization is to actually raise the revenue and improve the profitability and efficiency of the said functions. Next, here is an overview of the three prominent types of privatization according to Shakti 2013. First is delegation. So dito, binigyan ng government ang isang enterprise ng power to perform a public function that they cannot do on their own. Services are delivered on for profit basis but are still operating for public benefit and the government still has responsibility for this. Second is divestment. So they are still private companies doing public functions. But this time, wala ng responsibility yung government dito. And lastly is displacement. The first step is to allow the private sectors to enter the market and compete and outperform the public sector until the public enterprise is displaced. Now, let us move forward with the 7 methods of privatization. First is public sale of shares. So basically, we will sell shares of public companies owned by the state. In case it's confusing because I too have been confused, when we sell shares to make it private, in our case, since we're talking about a public sector being transferred to a private sector, ibebenta ang shares ng public enterprise to private purchasers, which can be limited lang. Sa case kasi ng PSE, when a company is listed there, it is a public listed company. Now, to make it private, we have to delist our company to the PSE. Sa example kasi sa IM, it's the National Stock Exchange. However, transferring a public to private sector is different to that. Next is public auction. So everyone's familiar with auction and bidding naman, so this works just the same. Pataasan ng offer. So for you to own a public enterprise, you have to have the highest bidding price. Next is public tender. So it's like an auction. We can compare it to that. But the difference is, kumbaga, pagalingan ito hindi lang ng presyo, kundi pati na rin ng investment proposal. The next one is direct negotiations. Just like the public tender, pagalingan pa rin tayo ng price and investment proposal. But this time, this is offered to the limited number of potential purchasers only. So for example, you are a private or let's say an individual investor and you want to own a public enterprise. So kung ang isang enterprise ay open for privatization via public tender or direct negotiations na na-mention ko kanina, you have to prepare an investment proposal. So it is a document being prepared na ang goal is to motivate or convince the public enterprise to enter a business relationship with you. Next is transfer of control. Still transferring from public to private. So when we say public-owned, it is state-owned. So kung hindi naging successful yung privatization process previously ng public enterprise na to, so this method can be applied. And para magawa yun, mag-i-issue tayo ng convertible bonds. So when we say convertible bonds, ito yung mga bonds na pwedeng ma-convert into stocks. Na again, magagamit lang if hindi naging successful yung previous privatization process ng isang public enterprise. For the 6th method, we have lease with option to purchase. So kung ikaw ang purchaser ng public enterprise under this method and you will acquire full rights and use to whatever enterprise na gusto mong i-own, you have the option na bilhin ito and just fulfill the other conditions for it to be yours. So pwedeng lease now, pay later, or lease now, purchase later. Parang ganun. Now, for our 7th and last method in accordance to our IM, we have combination of privatization methods. So, ginagamit lang ang method na ito kapag yung public enterprise na pinag-uusapan ay importante sa overall infrastructure or ekonomiya ng isang bansa. So, that is the only time na we can use combinations in the methods of privatization. Now, before we end, I would like to show you the advantages and disadvantages of privatization. So, for the advantages, it can promote efficient use of resources. Since magiging profit basis na siya, mas kokontrolin na ng company yung resources kasi para mas makatipid and matuloy yung function ng enterprise na to. Of course, without compromised quality. Next is magkakaroon na ng healthy competition dahil hindi na yung state yung naghahawak ng enterprise. So, magkakaroon tayo ng balance sa industry. Next is reduced burden on the government. So, syempre, since hindi na sila yung nagmamanage and to some na hindi na nila responsibility, mababawasan yung bagay na inaasikaso ng government, allowing them to focus on other things na mas mahalaga pa sa isang bansa. Chances of monopoly are eliminated. So, dito naman, since hindi na nga under ng government ang isang certain function, then malaya na yung ibang company to compete with the same function or industry. And through competition rin kasi, mas nagiging better ang services na ino-offer ng companies. Another advantage is reduced political involvement. So, syempre, mababawasan ng hidden pangangampanya and maiiwasan ang pagmamanipulate sa public funds. Lastly is employment creation. So, of course, mas maraming negosyo, mas maraming trabaho na makakatulong pa sa mas maraming tao, hindi lang sa consumers or users na isang specific na function. For the disadvantages naman, meron pa rin tayong chances of monopoly because yung ibang private companies dyan na may kakayahan, pwede nilang i-manipulate yung market in their favor. So, kung yung chances of monopoly ay na-eliminate as an advantage sa privatization, it's also a disadvantage. So, depende siya sa kung ano yung gagawin ng company or kung anong industry or function siya belong. So, next is public interest sectors. So, hindi rin kasi advisable ang privatization sa ibang sectors that should serve with non-profit motives like healthcare and education. So, with privatization kasi, we cannot do this one. So, at some point, disadvantage din siya sa public interest. So, next is short-term goals. So, pag private business kasi, more likely, they are focusing on profit and not for the long-term benefit of the users or consumers of the function that they offer, which is mahalaga naman sa part nating mga users. Lastly ay industry fragmentation. So, may chance na mawala yung firm na may significant market share or strong influence sa industry. Disadvantage siya dahil in performing a public function, syempre dapat may nasusunod tayong standard to ensure na enough yung quality na nare-receive ng clients natin. So, if wala, then magiging very random na lang siya and hindi na siya for the benefit of the public. So, that would be all for my part. Thank you very much.
Good day everyone and good day Sir Ramos. I'm Kim De Jesus here to discuss to you matters regarding anti-privatization and insolvency. Now, before we proceed further, baka siguro may magtatanong dyan, Kim, ano nga ba ang anti-privatization? Well, ganito yan. I will not bore you with fancy definition kasi obviously, kabaliktaran lang naman siya ng privatization, di ba? These are the collective voices or sentiments ng ilang, let's say, individuals, groups, organizations na nag-o-oppose or against sila dun sa idea mismo ng privatization and dun sa idea na siya daw ay much better and much beneficial para sa lahat, no? To give a concrete example, narinig yun na siguro yung Universal Healthcare Law dito sa Pilipinas na ang primary government agency ng papatupad ay ang PhilHealth, no? Merong two sides of this story. One is yung pro-privatization. These are yung mga private healthcare providers na siguro sinasabi or bino-voice out nila sa government na let the market decide na lang, no? Kasi nga bilang private institution sila, they will compete with each other na lang daw, lalo na sa sector ng healthcare. And the second side of the story is yung anti-privatization, which in this case is yung government. Kasi nga they are pushing for a universal healthcare para sa lahat, no? I-strengthen yung healthcare system natin na papatupad ng PhilHealth and para nga doon sa promise na hindi siya for profit making lang, na talagang may care yung government for its people. Anti-privatizationists argues that instead of making things better, privatization does otherwise. So now, here are 6 reasons. That's right, we will hear 6 reasons. Again, we will hear 6 reasons why privatization is a bad option to choose. The number 1 reason why privatization is bad option to choose is that it lacks accountability. Diba? Let's say a private or state-owned institution or entity happens to be privatized. The government or the public now has less control or less oversight over those matters regarding doon sa naging private na nga na entity. Parang ganito lang yun eh. Sa isang grupo minsan may problema. Diba? Ganito yung private yung mga private entities kapag may problema sa loob ng korporasyon nila o sa loob ng isang grupo, doon lang sila lang dapat yun. Hindi dapat yung lalabas, diba? Hindi dapat, alam yun. Whereas kapag dito sa atin sa public, no, here are concrete examples dito sa atin sa public or sa government, kapag may problems regarding certain funds ng iba't ibang institution, meron tayong commission or audit, meron tayong COA. Kapag meron tayong problems regarding taxation, di ba, yung mga taxes ng tao, pwede natin idulong sa BIR. Kapag naman meron mga tiwaling, mga nakaupo sa gobyerno, pwede tayong dumulog or pwede sila na mismo mag-pursue ng plunder cases. Ito yung mga sandigang bayan, ito yung ombudsman. Whereas sa private institutions or sa private firms, ano lang ba meron tayo? What do we have, no? Meron lang tayo dong HR department. Hindi sa minamaliit natin sila, pero minsan kasi may kinikilingan, may pinoprotektaan at hindi sa vision totoo lamang yung mga yan. Meron silang pinapaboran minsan eh. And that's the problem. It lacks accountability. Number 2, unfair wealth distribution. Now let's take for example yung PLDT, which is a former state-owned entity before it was privatized according na rin sa report ni Isa. No? We pay a lot to in the hopes of expecting good internet na maayos yung connectivity natin, but what do we get? Sometimes we get crappy internet, minsan nga hindi mo naman pakinabangan, no? PLDT enriches themselves. That's a problem. Remember the incident when Liza Soberano tweeted something about her internet connection, and what did PLDT do? No, parang nagkumahog sila. Naayos naman nila yung service. Maayos naman yun, pero mas maayos kung lahat yun nagagawa nila sa karamihan ng cases na dinudulong sa kanila mga social media accounts, sa Facebook, sa Twitter. Kasi ano nangyayari, naririnig ka nila pero di ka nila pinakikinggan. They enrich themselves. That's the problem ulit. Diba? Maayos, di naman sa pagiging bitter sa kanila o pagiging masyadong critical sa kanila, pero may mga investments naman sila na ginagawa. Meron na nga yung recently, di ba, yung 5G rollout nila, no, sa kanilang smart and even sa kanilang mga internet na pinoprovide. Pero the thing is, sa ibang lugar nga yung 3G and 4G, hindi pa rin maayos yung mga signals and yung kanilang mga cell sites. The problem again, they enrich themselves. No, they do not owe it to the people. Dapat binabalik natin sa tao. Yun nga, nagagawa mo nga yung gusto mong ibenta, yung mga internet services na ginagawa mo, pero hindi naman kasi sa lahat nagiging fair, kumbaga, no? They enrich themselves. That's the problem again. Yun kasi yun, no? Yung unfair wealth distribution. Dapat they tend to always serve the people. Number 3, cuts essential services. Now, Kim, what do you mean by it cuts essential services? Now, let's take this scenario as an example. Imagine the government having a bus transport service, no, that serves commuters from urban to rural areas, rural to urban areas, urban to urban areas, and also rural to rural areas, no, yung probinsya sa probinsya mga ano. Now once privatized, sa tingin niyo ano mangyayari, no? Malamang sa malamang they would stop the operations maybe of those trips, no, from probinsya sa probinsya, in the hopes na mabawasan yung cost na ini-incur nila, and alam naman natin obviously para mas mapataas pa nila yung profits nila and mas mag-focus sila dun sa mga areas na merong competitive edge, na merong mas posibilidad na mas kumita pa sila. That's the problem eh. It cuts, they leave their moral and social obligations to the people. Another one is, let's take again yung company ng PLDT, no, yung Smart, no. Let's say Smart and Globe, yung mga telecommunications company na yan. How often do we see na mararaming cell sites and maayos yung signal reception sa mga probinsyang lugar, no, sa mga rural areas natin, sa mga kanayunan. Bihirang-bihira, di ba? Kasi bakit nga naman daw siguro sila mag-invest ng napakalaking kapital o maglalabas ng malaking capital outlay sa mga lugar na bibihira lang din naman yung mga cellphone subscribers, no, yung mga gumagamit. Pero di ba, you see, in the advent of technology and di ba, itong social media and such, hindi na malabo kasi na mahina pa rin, no, yung sinasabi nilang users dun sa mga certain areas na yon. Kaya dapat we owe to the people, again and again, we must be true dun sa ating social and moral obligations, di ba? Not to serve the people. Kasi sila naman, sa kanila naman nag-emanate yung kinikita natin, yung mga, kaya tayo lagi nag-innovate and such, no? That's the problem, no? They cut essential services. Number 4, the fourth reason why privatization is a bad option to choose is that it derails goals, no? Goals of nation building, goals of the state, goals of the government. Let's take NFA as an example, the National Food Authority, na as we all know is famous for its NFA rice because of its goal to provide nutritious rice, quality rice at an affordable cost, no? Mainly yun yung kanilang goal, na to provide nutritious rice, yung mga nakaano na, no, yung sinasako-sako na, to lessen, maybe in the hopes na another goal nila, malesen yung hunger rates dito sa atin sa bansa. I remember the time na meron yung parang project yung NFA nung elementary pa ako, naalala ko noon. Parang nagpapadala sila sa mga school ng bigas-bigas na maliliit na yung tigi isang kilo na nakapakete na parang kapag may card giving na sa amin, no, card viewing, parang naalala ko na nagbibigay sila ng parang tatlong piraso noon. Tapos ang special pa rin, naalala ko lang, is that meron yung meron yung parang golden bottle doon sa loob ng bigas na yun sa per kilo na yun, na parang doon daw yung nutrition, yung mga special nutrients na parang inuuwi yun sa atin. Madalas naiaabot din yon more likely sa mga lower sections natin, sa atin sa school, sa elementary and such. Once privatized again, ano kaya mangyayari yun? Mapupursue, mag-i-stay true pa ba sila dun sa goal na to provide nutritious, affordable rice for the people, to lessen hunger rate siguro, in the hopes na yun nga ay matupad nila. Yung mga goals kaya na yun mangyari pa rin or matupad pa rin nila once privatized? I don't think so, kasi maaari ang unang mangyari is do sa price pa lang, no, sa pricing pa lang maaring may magbago na. Pwedeng mas maging bihira na lang siya kasi nga hindi na siya papatukin ng masa kasi nga yung price niya iba na rin, or baka maaring lumibel na rin, no, do sa mga commercial rice na meron din tayo. So, di ba, the goals are not set, the eyes are not set on the goal, no, ng government previously once privatized na yung let's say NFA nga in that case. Again, it derails goals. Number 5, it adds job loss. Let's say a certain government controlled entity becomes privatized. It creates a hole in its employees, no. It tends to relieve or to fire some employees, to let go some employees because its eyes are keen to cost cutting. Now it makes me wonder, nung panahon nung nawasa, yung nabanggit ni Isa na yung water institution na nagsusupervise sa ating mga patubig natin noon, no? It makes me wonder na noong na parang na-destabilize siya or parang inhinto siya, and comes here yung MWSS na nagkocontrol sa dalawang private water concessionaires natin here in the metro, Maynilot and Manila Water. What happens dun sa kanilang employees, no, na they did their best, they're doing their best, and they wish to do their best, kaso nanalify yung efforts nila. And that's sad, no. Isa yun sa mga kinakonsider natin, no, mga kinakonsider natin na factors na, di ba, parang it adds job loss na imbis na sila kino-consider natin, no. That's why yung mga critics ng privatization hates the idea nga, no, of privatization, because as to some extent it troubles some employees, yung kanilang families and such, because nga it adds job loss. The sixth and final reason why privatization is a bad choice is that the service quality, no, erodes. no? I'm not here to offend anyone in the class, but some of my friends told me na iba nga daw yung trato. When we talk about educational sector, our educational sector, iba nga daw yung trato ng private schools to public schools sa kanilang mga students, no? Whereas sa private schools daw, sometimes, no, some of these schools spoon feed too much, no? Parang hindi ganong kalaban magturo. Yung iba daw, maybe because yung actions of private schools, they tend to hire maybe teachers who doesn't pass the LET, no? Yung licensure examination for teachers, in the hopes na mag-cross-cutting na naman sila to enrich themselves and not serve the people, no? In this case, the students. Whereas sa public schools naman daw, nang napansin nila nung nalipat nga sila na parang, oh nga, no, it differs, no, yung teaching methods, medyo, kumaga, they do it the hard way, no? That is a problem when organizations, private organizations, or once yung mga state-owned organization entities becomes privatized, minsan na-downgrade yung service quality nga nila. Because yung hopes nga nila o yung pagnanais nila na to enrich themselves are using yung wealth, kumaga yung profit na lagi nilang inaatim and not providing the good service or of good quality, no, ng service na dapat na kanilang ibinibigay sa tao. That is why yung mga critics ng privatization hates talaga the idea of privatization itself because of these 6 reasons that I've mentioned all throughout, that makes the point na they truly hate it, and some of us might think na baka hindi nga naman maganda. To some extent maybe privatizing some organizations and institutions are good, but on some vital sectors of our society, maybe yung healthcare, education system and such, hindi siya doable. That is why those are the 6 reasons, no, why privatization is a bad choice. For the last part of my report, I'll be talking about insolvency. Kanina Kim, anti-privatization. Ngayon naman, insolvency. Ano ba yan? Parang sa accounting ko lang huling narinig yun dati. Well, hear me out. Insolvency just refers to the situation ng group of individuals or corporation or organizations na they aren't able to settle their liabilities, they cannot pay their bills, their dues, and such for reasons that they themselves only knew. After knowing what insolvency is, we must now learn that there are two, no? Again, there are two, not just one, but two aspects of defining insolvency, or 2 kinds of insolvency that I would be discussing in these succeeding slides. For the first kind of insolvency, it is called cash flow fluidity or cash flow insolvency, which refers to yung kakulangan or lack of funds or lack of cash to pay off its dues, its unresolved liabilities and bills. No, there are cases that we cannot pay accounts payable that are not in cash. Take for example rent, di ba? When we talk about rent, we do pay it with cash, maybe pwede ring check kung medyo malaki yung yung area na nire-rent out. We cannot pay it by lending yung nagpaparent ng place sa atin ng office equipment, office machines. We cannot pay them with that. We must kumaga, it talks about yung pagbayad natin ng cash, yung kakulangan ng cash ng isang company para ma-pay off yung kanyang mga dues. Yun ay matatawag natin na cash flow fluidity or cash flow insolvency. The last and second kind of insolvency or defining insolvency is yung asset insolvency, which talks about yung when a company's asset is lesser than its liabilities, no, na mas marami pa yung dues niya, yung bills niya kaysa dun sa assets in hand niya, no. It may be cash or non-cash kinds of assets, but it simply talks about na mas less nga yung company assets compared to its liabilities. That is what we call, again, asset insolvency. After knowing what is insolvency, after learning what are the 2 kinds of insolvency, now we go to the consequences of insolvency. This refers to matters or things that they might face when they are closing in a state of being insolvent. And here I have listed, or I will discuss 2 main things that they might face when again they are being labeled or close to being labeled as insolvent companies. The first and foremost thing that might happen pag nalaman sa kumpanya na they are closing in at being insolvent is the reaction of its shareholders and its stakeholders. This could refer to the direct or the immediate board of directors of the company, the investors of the company, the suppliers of the company, the creditors of the company, and even the employees of the company. Diba? Knowing that they are in the verge of being not able to pay off their liabilities, some of them might wonder, mababayaran pa ba tayo nito, no, sa kanilang mga supplier and creditors, mag-invest pa ba tayo dito sa mga investors, and even sa employees, no, is their job safe, no, meron pa bang kasiguraduhan nito, or even mababayaran ba yung simpleng salaries nila sa mga susunod na buwan, and that in its simplest form is a huge consequence, no, of insolvency for a certain company. The second and final consequence a company facing insolvency is going bankrupt. Knowing that all that has been said and all that has been done fails to resolve this insolvency, all measures, all activities that came from the top management, the collaboration between the middle management and all its employees, even though that it cannot resolve, no, even though it won't resolve its insolvency problems, what the next big thing or the next great thing to do might be filing for bankruptcy. Notwithstanding the fact that they have tried all solutions, all remedies, but you see, if they cannot resolve it, maybe just, file for bankruptcy. And sir, just to give my realizations while doing this part of our report, I would like to go back to good governance, no? One of the core principle of our subject, good governance and CSR. Good governance, I think, is the main thing around privatization, because you see, if a government entity or government controlled entity decides to privatize itself, the governing body or the top management of it must do all necessary things, must talk to all necessary sides and hear them out to balance the costs and benefits of maybe, you see, privatizing it later on. Whereas when we talk about insolvency, again, it is the top management that must listen to all sides, that must consider all possible factors to resolve the insolvency in the company, because the lives of employees are on the line, business transactions are on the line, some business deals might be canceled if this insolvency case is not settled. Now, we must remember that good governance is still in the center of all of this, and we must remember that by serving the people, by fully serving and knowing what they want and they need, maybe we could resolve all of these problems once and for all. And now, to talk more about insolvency law and to talk about business rehabilitation, up next is Dianne Encarnacion.
Good day, everyone. I am Racy Dianne Encarnacion, your last reporter. I am going to discuss about the last part of the Module 7, which is the corporate governance and significance with the insolvency regimes. I am going to discuss about the topic of the insolvency law, its features, process, and the business rehabilitation. And since patas ang ating pag-uusapan, please bear with my discussion because i-discuss or i-explain ko lang to based on my understanding. One of the objectives of this module is to know the effects of the insolvency regime in the corporate governance. But to better understand what really are the effects of the insolvency regimes on the corporate governance, let us first identify what is the insolvency and what is insolvency law. By this time, siguro naman alam na natin kung ano yung insolvency at saka insolvency law. But let us recall. Ang insolvency, it means that the insolvent debtor is having insufficient asset to pay for her or his liabilities. While the insolvency law, it was created para naman magkaroon ng relief yung individual debtor or sometimes full discharge dun sa mga claims ng kanyang creditors. Pero syempre, there are limitations and considerations kung saan parang magbe-benefit yung creditor at saka yung debtor. Insolvency law, it also provides equitable treatment, syempre, sa creditor at saka sa debtor. In dealing with insolvency law, there is a term business rehabilitation. It refers to the restoration of the debtor to a condition na kung saan successful ang kanilang operation and magkakaroon sila ng chance to be solvent again. If they have foreseen that that business can recover and be able to pay their liabilities. In simple words, business rehabilitation is an opportunity given to the debtors para or sa may mga utang para ipagpatuloy nila yung kanilang operation ng business at para makapagbayad sila sa kanilang mga pinagkakautangan at hindi pa madagdagan yung mga claims sa kanila. After knowing what is the meaning of insolvency law and the business rehabilitation, let us go on deeper or better understanding by focusing on the Philippines' own insolvency law and business rehabilitation. The insolvency proceedings on the Philippines are governed by the Act number 1956 or the Insolvency Law of the Philippines. Ito yung batas kung saan maaaring magpetition ang isang may pagkakautang or inutangan para magkaroon ng legal na proseso ang mangyayaring bayaran ng utang. That filed petition by either the corporation, the partnership, or the association for insolvency and suspension of payments are all processed and heard in the court. While yung business rehabilitation proceedings naman sa Pilipinas, it has rules and procedures that were released by the Supreme Court. Kaya Supreme Court yung nagre-release ng rehabilitation proceedings was because August 8, that was in year 2000, the Securities Regulation Code transferred the jurisdiction over the petitions for rehabilitation and suggestion or suspension of payments for corporations and partnerships from the Securities and Exchange Commission to the regular courts. With that, yung mga debtors or creditors na gustong mag-file ng petition, madali na lang sa kanila na maipasa yon kasi sa regional courts na lang naman nila yun ipapasa. To further understand what is the Philippine Insolvency Law, let us discuss the Financial Rehabilitation and Insolvency Act of 2010. It governs the rehabilitation of the liquidation of debtors, may it be a sole proprietor, a partnership, corporation, or even an individual debtor. Based on the law, the Financial Rehabilitation and Insolvency Act of 2010 guarantees timely, fair, transparent, effective, and even efficient rehabilitation or liquidation of debtors. Mayroong tatlong remedy na ino-offer ang FRIA or the Financial Rehabilitation and Insolvency Act of 2010. Sa mga insolvent debtors, it's a creditor. These are the suspension of payments, the financial rehabilitation, and lastly, the liquidation. Sa suspension of payments, from the word suspension, it clearly explains that there is an act of stopping or making the payment ineffective temporarily. While sa financial rehabilitation naman, gaya ng explanation kanina sa business rehabilitation, just the same, it supports the workable and somehow profitable businesses so that they can continue their operation and have opportunities to recover and transform their business. Dito sa financial rehabilitation, yung corporation or yung individual debtors and partnership, they should maintain their assets and para pag nagtuloy sila ng kanilang business operation, makakabawi sila and makakagain sila ng profit para mas mabayaran nila yung mga pagkakautang nila. Lastly is the liquidation. It is the process of ending a business. And with that, the debtor's assets are converted to cash or either it can be in any kind that is going to be distributed to the creditors para ma-discharge na sila dun sa kanilang claim. Sa instructional material na nagaling kay Sir, under ng Philippine Insolvency Law was the discussion about the suspension of payments, the voluntary and involuntary insolvency. Yung suspension of payments, gaya nga ng nasabi kanina, it is delaying or stopping temporarily of the payment of the debtor until they have enough assets to repay all their liabilities. Yung petition for suspension of payments ay maaari lamang i-file ng isang debtor. It is granted to the individual insolvent debtor or the debtor that has assets na nag-exceed sa kanyang mga utang pero nakikitaan pa rin ng possibility na hindi niya kayang mabayaran ng mga ito pagka malapit na mag-due or sa due mismo. Yung suspension of payments, it can be voluntary or involuntary. Saka naman dito papasok yung two kinds of insolvency, which is the voluntary insolvency and the involuntary insolvency. Yung voluntary insolvency, it is filed by the debtors or yung may pagkakautang, applying to be discharged from their liabilities. And this petition, um, it will be passed or filed sa regional trial court ng kanilang province. Yun yung sinasabi ko kanina na yung mga petition is sa regional court na pinapasa. Kaya nagpapasa ng ganitong petition, ang isang may utang ay para mabigyan sila ng chance to have more time para mabayaran yung utang nila or makapag-ipon para mabayaran. And they are hoping for the declaration of suspension of payments, discharge, or even liquidation or insolvency. While yung involuntary insolvency naman, it is filed by the creditors. Kung kanina, ang nag-filed is yung may utang, dito naman, ang magpa-file ay yung nagpautang. This kind of insolvency is a legal judgment of insolvency but it should be filed by 3 or more creditors na pare-parehong Filipino citizens and kung saan yung credit or yung demand ay nangyari lang din sa Pilipinas. Ang uri ng insolvency na ito ay nabuo para makapagbayad ang mga debtors sa kanilang mga pinagkakautangan. Lahat ng non-exempt property ng isang may utang ay i-distribute sa kanyang mga pinagkakautangan, syempre, para hindi na mas lumaki pa yung mga dapat pang bayaran ng mga to. After knowing some information about the Philippine Insolvency Law, let us discuss the features of the Insolvency Law, which is the rehabilitation and the distributive. First is the rehabilitation. As discussed earlier, it was given to a business to have more breathing space para makarecover sila from its temporary liquidity or even financial difficulties. Dito sa rehabilitation, gaya ng nasabi kanina, it provides opportunity for the business to continue or even restructure their business. One of the features of insolvency law is distributive. According to the IM, distributive effect is a proper and unequal distribution of the debtor's properties to their creditors para ma-discharge sila sa kanilang pagkakautang. This also allows the debtors to have a fresh start. It is usually implemented when there are no commercially viable option for rehabilitation. Sa normal case, ang discharge, it means having no imposed punishment. While in an insolvency law, yung discharge, it means legal or formal discharge of an insolvent debtor to his or her liabilities or obligation. Pero syempre, there are um, exceptions or reserved by the law. Um, it can only happen if the enterprise undergoes liquidation. Following liquidation, the courts guarantee the honest, non-fraudulent, and debtor with a complete discharge. Individual borrowers discharge following the liquidation of their business may be a suitable way to give them a clean slate. Along with the distribution, yung merong makikitaan na din na it also highly probable that a lot of creditors will not have been paid back in full. This urged the dilemma about whether such creditors may still have a claim towards the borrower or whether the borrower will indeed be fully discharged from such remaining claims. This is usually accomplished by placing a hold on creditors' ability to exercise their claims toward the debtor and appointing an independent liquidator whose main obligation is to maximize the value of the debtor's asset proceeding to payment to the creditors. Our next discussion will focus on the rehabilitation law process. The court-supervised rehabilitation proceedings are initiated by either the debtor or by the creditors, representing a minimum amount of claims. With the goal of putting in place a rehabilitation plan, the court conducts the rehabilitation processes, assigns a receiver, and assesses which charges towards the borrower are legitimate. This rehabilitation plan must be approved by both parties, the creditor and the debtor. If ever the rehabilitation plan was not approved by the court within a year, the debtor will undergo liquidation. But during the time that the rehabilitation proceedings are pending in the court, the claims against the debtor are suspended. And under the Financial Rehabilitation and Insolvency Act of 2010, the court supervised proceedings are one of the possibilities for insolvent debtors or legal entities to be rehabilitated. And when the court judges the petition for rehabilitation to be acceptable in form and content, it will grant a commencement order within 5 working days after the petition's filing. Well, a commencement order, para mas magets natin, it is a form of a legal instrument which is created to not take immediate action considering all or part of a law without the legislative approval. Sa rehabilitation process, mag-undergo to ng stay or suspension order. It is a court order that temporarily or permanently stops or suspends a proceeding or judgment. Dito, yung court, they can decide if they will lift or the stay order and continue the case depende sa binibigay nilang date. Indicated naman sa IM natin na ang creditor, they should have at least the 25% of the borrower's total liabilities bago makapag-appeal yung debtor sa regional trial court para mag-place sila under rehabilitation. Unless the court determines the request acceptable, syempre in form and content, it grants a stay order that suspends all enforcing claims towards the debtor. Kahit anong actions or proceedings para sa execution of charges toward the debtor, measures to impose any judgment or attachment, or even temporary remedy para sa debtor, lahat yon subject sa stay order. It prevents the sale or lien of the property other than in the normal operation of the business nung debtor. It also prohibits the borrower from making payment unless the rule or the law allows it. And then the purpose of this stay order or suspension order is to allow the rehabilitation receiver, which we are going to discuss later, they can concentrate mostly on the borrower's rehabilitation without being disturbed by court proceedings if merong stay order. Next thing that should be considered in the rehabilitation proceedings or process is the settlement for the security of the creditors, which is the adequate protection. The secured creditors, which are the lenders who are securing their collaterals, it can be a bank or even other asset-based lender that holds a fixed or even floating charge over a business asset or assets. They need assurance, syempre, to ensure that the collateral interest will be safeguarded safeguarded against decline in value throughout the occurrence of the insolvency or rehabilitation proceedings. A simple reminder that the stay order may be lifted if there is inadequate protection. Upon disposition or suggestion of the rehabilitation receiver, the court can order a secured creditor to enforce his security or lien, or even seize on debtor property guaranteeing its claims, if indeed the property is not required for the debtor's rehabilitation and recovery. The secured creditor or other collateral owners are only allowed to participate in the rehabilitation processes for the residue of their claim, if there are any. During the rehabilitation process, there is the presence of a rehabilitation receiver, yun yung tinutukoy kanina. This is the appointed officer of the court, which can be a request of a creditor or a debtor. Ang rehabilitation receiver, yun yung napaka-importante sa rehabilitation process dahil ito yung nagfa-facilitate or tumutulong sa korte para makapag-establish ng rehabilitation plan para sa financially struggling borrower. This rehabilitation receiver should be a Filipino citizen and seems to have the essential understanding of insolvency and other applicable commercial regulations, laws, and even processes. And also, they should have the necessary expertise or experience to perform the duties and responsibilities of a rehabilitation receiver effectively, especially that the court's judgment might depend on the results of their work. The next term that is very important in the rehabilitation process is the equality is equity principle. On this part, the unsecured creditors, which are the person or company that lends credit without requiring the borrower to put up any property as collateral. If a debtor misses on an unsecured loan, the creditor cannot seize any of the borrower's property first without winning a case in the court or lawsuit. It can be a credit card company, utilities, tenants, hospitals, and medical offices. That unsecured creditors demands an equal treatment with secured creditors for any payments made under the court-approved rehabilitation plans. Whenever the distributions are to be made through safety or even other properties of the business, the unsecured creditors assert that all of these resources are part of the business, the so-called distributable assets. In a rehabilitation during the rehabilitation proceedings. The intention of rehabilitation is not to weaken security interest. It involves a freeze on the execution of all creditors' claims. It cannot authorize the distribution of secured property to all creditors, even secured or unsecured, without even correlating and suitable substitute of such assets. Whenever a company that is facing insolvency is handed over by a rehabilitation receiver, all the creditors, even secured or unsecured, they should be treated equally. Instead of filing lawsuits toward the insolvent business in the court, the creditors were ordered to submit their claims through the rehabilitation receiver, who is a lawfully designated Securities and Exchange Commission officer that syempre trusted na yun kasi nga galing siya sa SEC. All assets of a corporation under the rehabilitative receivership are kept in care for the fair advantage of all the creditors in order to prevent one creditor from gaining an edge or favor over another through the convenience of attachment, even delivery, or other means. The crucial concept in terms of creditors is equality and equity. Yun nga, dapat pantay-pantay lang lahat ng natatanggap ng mga creditors galing dun sa debtor. This principle implies that the equity would not favor one party over another. A rehabilitation receiver, for example, who has been assigned to gather the assets of an insolvent firm, they will have to use the earnings of the debtor to pay each creditor an equitable amount of the loan unpaid by the debtor. The last consideration in the rehabilitation law process is the cram down or the cram down effect. This occurs when a court orders an insolvency restructuring plan despite the opposition from certain creditors. Kahit di pumayag yung ibang creditors. It is the compulsory implementation of a restructuring plan by a court. If we are the creditors, of course, we are going to impose our own terms and conditions, having in mind that we can get greater interest. But with the crown down effect or crown down clause, it requires creditors to embrace the rehabilitation plan's terms and conditions, favoring the lengthy profitability rather than a somewhat quick yet um, maybe unreliably or unreliable to recover. Siyempre, kapag yung ginagawa ng court na rehabilitation plan, they are considering din naman yung haba ng binibigay nilang chance sa debtor kung kaya ba nilang i-recover yung kanilang business para mas makapagbayad sila sa kanilang creditor. Siyempre, kapag ka naman binigyan nila ng mahabang panahon, magkakaroon ng chance yung business na mas masaayos pa yung operation nila at magkakaroon sila ng tamang pagsasagawa ng mga plano para mas makapag-gain pa sila ng profit. Hindi basta lang kung ano yung gusto ng creditor, yun na lang ang gagawin nila. To further understand what really are the effects of this insolvency law to the corporate governance, let us first recall what is the meaning of the corporate governance. Corporate governance is a system that governs a corporation. Siyempre, kinokontrol nito at dinadirect yung corporation. It is a process of establishing fairness, transparency, and accountability in a company. It essentially portrays the period at the leadership and how management wants to govern the company's operations. In financial terms, it refers to the combination of the well-defined regulations, procedures, and policies that govern how corporate activities and restrictions are carried out for financial conditions of the company. Syempre, most businesses, they go through great lengths to establish a high level of corporate governance. The board of directors is responsible for developing a corporate governance structure that aligns with the company's goals and mission. Mas madali kasing mapapasunod ng mga mas madali nilang mag-govern yung corporation kung naka-align yung ginawa nilang corporate governance sa kanilang goals and mission. Syempre, para mas maging effective. As a result, corporate governance is associated with the concerns such as operational effectiveness and efficiency. It can also be concerning with the financial information accuracy, compliance with applicable laws, and asset sustaining. The corporate governance has an impact on capital market function and development. And syempre, yung allocation of resources. It has an impact on the corporate behavior and productivity as well as the innovative behavior, entrepreneurial, and economic growth. There are effects or impact of the insolvency law in the corporate governance. First is the weak insolvency mechanisms that lack credibility that results to having a profoundly negative effect on the corporate governance. Alam naman natin yung, gaya nga ng sinabi ko kanina, the corporate governance should be established considering the compliance with the applicable laws, including the insolvency regime. If the government has a weak insolvency law, it might lead to the corporations having also a poor corporate governance. Alam naman natin na lahat ng company ang gusto ay makagain ng profit. And with that, they can have a healthy financial condition. But if there is an effective insolvency regime, yung mga company na nakakaranas ng financial difficulties, maaari pa silang makabangon. May chance pa sila para makarecover. And effective insolvency laws can result to an effective corporate governance, which can help the corporation to gain a stand of being a trustworthy company. It can also increase the company's restructuring or even rehabilitation plans and options in utilizing their assets. And of course, it can help the corporations to avoid experiencing unprofitable risk-taking activities. And next, regarding kapag ang company naka-experience na ng discharge, since yung corporate governance, it's most important requirement is the nature and scope of the accountability of all the people in the workplace, and of course, the accountability of the corporation itself. The existence of an insolvency regime helps the corporations who are having financial difficulties to have a fresh start. But there are times na kapag naranasan na ng isang company or business na makapag-file ng petition or mag-undergo ng insolvency or ma-discharge sa isang lawsuit regarding syempre sa insolvency, maaaring mahirapan ito na magsimula ulit at makakuha ng tiwala ng ibang creditors. Syempre, maaaring mag-iba ang interes ng kanilang stakeholders, resulting to the difficulties for the company on even meeting all of their obligations to their stakeholders. Sino ba namang stakeholder ang hindi magbabago ng interes kapag nalaman nilang yung isang company ay maaaring hindi makabayad ng pagkakautang? Dito naman papasok yung corporate governance as it reflects the accurate financial systems and information ng isang company. During the process of rehabilitation to the company or rehabilitation of the company, it can establish an effective corporate governance, ensuring that all the corporation suppliers of finance can get their proper return on investment. Siyempre, risk-taking ang mangyayari. Kasi during the process of insolvency, the creditors are being protected. Isang paghahanda rin ito para sa mga itatayo pa lamang na negosyo. Pwede nilang maiwasan ang anumang financial problems kung iisipin nila na una pa lamang yung mga hindi magandang epekto ng lawsuit na ito. Specifically na insolvency law ito. Maaari din nilang mas mapagtibay yung kanilang i-establish na corporate governance as it also concerns with the sustaining of the asset. The third effect of insolvency regime to corporate governance is the avoidance of powers and related parties. Dito naman, yung insolvency regime, it can lead an organization to create an effective, efficient, and even ethical corporate governance. If the company were approaching insolvency through the insolvency regime, this company can have the rights to avoid the claims. This power can provide the debtors an ability to recover their cash or any kind of transfer to creditors that was transacted or nangyaring transaction during a questionable period before the insolvency. Um, with that, the corporate governance concerning the operation and the financial conditions of a company, they can be restructured or improved to make enough or more revenue that will be distributed to all the creditors na para sa payment. Kung mapapansin nyo, dun sa una nating discussion about the effects of insolvency regimes sa corporate governance, there are advantage and disadvantage of having this law affecting the corporate governance of a certain company. The insolvency regime serves as the means to ensure the allocation of risk among participants in a market economy in a predictable, equitable, and transparent manner. In corporate governance, insolvency regime help in the corporate restructuring for the betterment of the company's operation. Siyempre, it can give a company an ability to take advantage of the opportunities and can reduce the risk from the claims. It can allocate risk among creditors for the benefit of the borrower. The corporate governance is associated with the obedience or compliance with the laws concerning its existence and operation. Yun naman ang main considerations sa rules of risk allocation. This allocation must be predictable and clearly specified in the law. And as the insolvency regime clearly stands for the equitable treatment among creditors, the corporate governance of a company can be improved that will direct its operation to have a better financial recovery plan for the benefit of all the creditors. In the allocation of risk concerning the transparency, the insolvency proceedings provide the participants with the accurate and sufficient information. And then the last effect of the insolvency regime in corporate governance can happen during the rehabilitation proceedings. It can protect and maximize the value of the asset of the borrower. The success of this effect might only happen if there is the fulfillment of the other effect of the insolvency regime, which is the risk allocation, yung nauna kanina. As it protects and maximizes value for the advantage of all the participants or the economy in general, the corporate governance can focus on the on their market, on the profitability, and even effective implementations for a successful operation. In conclusion, insolvency regime increases the credit availability and lower the cost of the credit. It also encourages entrepreneurial operations as it provides security or preventive measures towards the financial difficulties. And the possible benefit of an economy through having an insolvency regime, they can be in the it can be in the provisions of more business and more employment opportunities. With its existence, the market disturbance is minimized. It can save struggling companies, can provide the ability to be more productive, and it can contribute to successful financial activity. The banks and other creditors are willing to lend money or assets because they know that kapag nagpautang sila, meron namang insolvency regime, they can still recover or regain their investments if ever na mag-fail ang isang business. It is true that a law like this insolvency law can improve the business environment in the Philippines and other countries, especially that it can help a company achieve financial stability. That's all. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for listening.